now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. President Obama's executive action on immigration has provoked a firestorm of controversy over the appropriate use of presidential power. He is not the first president to strain the Constitution, to comment on the immigration executive orders, and to offer an historical perspective. I'm very pleased to be joined by the author of the timely new book, Suicide Pact: The Radical Expansion of Presidential Powers and the Lethal Threat to American Liberty. He is the senior judicial analyst at Fox News. Please welcome Judge Andrew Napolitano. Judge, thanks for being here.
Raymond, it's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you. You open the book with St. Thomas More, of all people, and tie this to the origins of our rights. Explain.
Well, when Moore was being tried for treason, and he had just finished a term as the Lord Chancellor of England, the rough equivalent of today's
Prime Minister.
The alleged, and under the horrible law at the time, proven act of treason was silence. His refusal to acknowledge publicly and in writing that King Henry VIII was the head of the Roman Catholic Church in England. He represented himself. He knew he was going to lose. He knew he'd be beheaded, and he ultimately was. But he also knew he could make an argument to the jury that would resonate for centuries, and it did. So looking at the jurors who had been handpicked by Henry's henchmen, he said, some men say the earth is round and some men say it is flat. An issue of some dispute.
Yes, at the time.
In 1535. But if it is round, could the king's command flatten it? And if it is flat, could the parliament make it round? Now, he was appealing to their common sense. Of course, the king and the parliament can't change the shape of the earth, but he was building upon an argument that there is an order of things which he and we call the natural law, which restrains everybody, even the mightiest king and the mightiest parliament on the planet. From that argument, not original with him, but extrapolated by him from Aquinas and Aristotle and Augustine, and extrapolated after him by John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, we get the concept of natural rights, areas of human behavior for which we do not need a permission slip from the government in order to make choices in those areas, because they are gifts to us from God. The one thing we have in common with God, who made us in his image and likeness, is freedom. And these freedoms, thought, speech, worship, travel, self-defense, privacy, basically going down the Bill of Rights, are gifts that we own. They can't be taken away by the government. They can't be taken away by a majority vote. They can only be taken away if we violate somebody else's natural law.
Right, but yet it happens all the time. They are being taken away and whittled away at.
And I'll tell you why it happens. And this is a criticism of both parties.
No, this book is a criticism of both parties.
Yes, it is, because both political parties, Republican and Democrat, agree. There are exceptions. Rand Paul and Ted Cruz are exceptions. There's a couple dozen exceptions in the House of Representatives. But for the most part, the leadership and the rank and file in Congress of both parties agree on the three transcendental issues of our age. The first is, what is the origin of our rights? They reject Jefferson. They reject Moore. They reject natural rights. They believe Mitch McConnell, John Boehner, Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, they believe that our rights come from the government and that the government can open the spigot in good times or close it in bad times. They also believe in perpetual war and perpetual debt.
Now, why? You make that. I've read a couple of articles where you make that case.
Well,
that war and debt are the two things both parties agree on and perpetuate.
Correct. They believe in debt because they would not be able to finance their wars if they paid the bills when they came due. The public would simply stop paying its taxes. They believe in war because war is the health of the state. When we are at war and people are afraid, they will stand on ration lines, they will pay higher taxes, they will do exactly what the government tells them because they'll accept the nonsense that the government preaches, that by surrendering their liberty, they somehow will be
protect
safer.
themselves.
Correct.
And this has been a pattern. And this book really, if I had to summarize it, is...
Did you like this book?
I did like it. I'm going to tell you why. It reminds you of the breathtaking presidential law breaking that is nothing new to our age.
Right.
This has really gone on from the beginning. And can you walk me through some of the greatest hits, if you will, to the Republic from Lincoln?
The first half of the book is a history of presidential law breaking and law making from George Washington and Bill Clinton. George Washington cut the heads off of soldiers who deserted, even though they were volunteers. He claimed he had the authority to do that from some source that he couldn't identify. John Adams punished, prosecuted people for criticizing him. Abraham Lincoln, of course,
habeas corpus.
Suspended habeas corpus. the right to be brought before a judge when you've been arrested,
right,
and to have the jailer compel legally and constitutionally your confinement. And he arrested and just threw in jail with no charge and no trial over 3,000 newspaper editors, not people shooting at his soldiers, but newspaper editors in the North. Woodrow Wilson,
the noble liar, you call him.
Yes, Woodrow Wilson arrested people for singing songs in German in public and during World War I, and for reciting the Declaration of Independence, which of course had been written by one of his predecessors, Jefferson, in front of draft offices. FDR confiscated gold, even though it was lawful to own, until one of his assistants said, you know, Mr. President, we need Congress to change that law. You can't make the ownership of something illegal. Only Congress can write the laws.
Talk about FDR for a moment, because you mentioned the War Powers Acts in this book. Again, it's an interesting primer for those who perhaps are unfamiliar with these moments in American history, and you can see the repetition of it right to the present.
Here's the theme of the entire book, not just the first half, which is Washington to Clinton, but even in the second half, which is just George W. Bush and Obama. When presidents break the law, when presidents violate the Constitution, when presidents invade natural rights and get away with it, it's unpunished, it's uninterfered with. Their successors will use what they did as a precedent for their own. So these things that were done by Washington and Adams and Wilson and Lincoln and FDR, forgive me, I got a little out of order there for a moment.
That's okay.
Were used as bases for the modern day president. Lincoln did this, therefore I can do it. Barack Obama argued the other day that because Ronald Reagan defined the term family under the amnesty of 1986, an amnesty, by the way, issued by the Congress, not by the president, which under the Constitution the Congress can do. And he defined the word family, which hadn't been defined in the statute, in a big-hearted way, to include more people than some thought ought to have been included. He was absolutely within his rights to do so. He was defining and refining the statute. When Barack Obama says to 5 million foreign nationals unlawfully present in the United States, hey guys, if you do A, B, C, D, and E, I won't deport you. And he makes up the A, B, C, D, and E. What is he doing constitutionally? He's rewriting the law. He's nullifying laws written by Congress. He's disenfranchising voters who have the right to send Congress to Washington under the understanding and belief that only they will write the laws. And he's violating his oath because he's refusing to uphold the laws that Congress has written.
Well, he says, and his supporters, this has been done before. Bush did it, G.W. Bush did it, as did President Reagan. They redefined immigration laws, Judge.
He is correct. Not to the extent to which he's doing it.
Because they did it in reaction to a congressional act.
They actually interpreted the words in a congressional act to make the act broader in its coverage. He is rejecting the law. He's not rejecting a law that he vetoed. He's rejecting a law that was the law when he took an oath to uphold the law. And Madison, who wrote the Constitution, and the presidential oath of office, as you know, and most folks watching us now know, is in the Constitution, told us in his notes, he added the word faithfully into that oath. You will enforce the laws faithfully, to remind presidents that they must enforce the laws whether they agree with them or not. So, listen, if George W. Bush spied and lied and tortured and brought us into an unjust war, Barack Obama has spied and lied and killed Americans under some sort of a bizarre theory that even though they're uncharged, untried, unconvicted, because due process is inconvenient, I can execute them. That is the most extreme legal argument ever made by a president of the United States. Even Lincoln, who killed Americans, at least argued, they are shooting at my soldiers, we can shoot back. It's a moral argument, but it's sound legally. There is no soundness to Barack Obama's argument.
You write in this book of George W. Bush that he began an aggressive public assault on personal freedoms. Talk to me about your concerns with the Patriot Act of 2001 and what it has borne in time.
The Patriot Act is arguably the most abominable, unconstitutional piece of legislation since the Alien and Sedition Acts, which enabled John Adams to punish political speech with which he disagreed. The Patriot Act actually does the unthinkable. One of the reasons the revolution was fought was because judges permitted British soldiers to write their own search warrants. These weren't American judges, these were British judges. This is called the Writs of Assistance Act. It was so unpopular that Parliament rescinded this authority, but the damage had been done. One of the reasons we have the Fourth Amendment is to assure that the government here would never do to Americans what the King and Parliament had done to colonists.
Right.
Lo and behold, the Patriot Act permits federal agents to write their own search warrants. And when they serve the search warrants on the possessor of documents or records, they say to that possessor of records, you can't tell anybody about this. You can't tell your spouse. You can't tell your priest in confessional. You can't tell your lawyer. You can't even tell a judge in a public courtroom, or we will prosecute you for speech. So the Patriot Act not only interferes with privacy, not only violates the Fourth Amendment, it violates the First Amendment by punishing speech. It's been held unconstitutional by 6 different federal judges. The government continues to use it all the time.
Wow. So Thomas More was right. Speech can get your silence can get your head lobbed off.
Yes, yes, Thomas More was right. But the quote that you extracted from the book is George W. Bush claiming that because we're at war, he has derived powers from some source other than the Constitution. He couldn't tell us what the source was. Well, he can't tell us what the source was because it doesn't exist.
Tell me about the Office of Legal Counsel, something this had totally escaped me, and I cover this stuff regularly.
Okay, the Office of Legal Counsel is often the most academic, intellectual lawyers in the Justice Department. It was once headed by a guy named William Rehnquist, who became Chief Justice. It was once headed by a guy named, very close to you and me and many of your listeners, Antonin Scalia.
Scalia, sure.
These are lawyers who provide legal advice to the president. Throughout history, they have provided neutral, apolitical legal advice about the meaning of federal law and the meaning of the Constitution. In the Bush years, it became a hotbed for the neocons of the Dick Cheney mentality, advising the president he could lie, he could torture, he could open a Devil's Island 90 miles off Miami. The treaties, the Geneva Conventions didn't apply. They gave him all kinds of political advice from which he demanded, which became his enablers to allow him to assault personal liberty openly and covertly. Wow. Covertly, because the NSA spying that Edward Snowden revealed did not start with Barack Obama. It started with George W. Bush.
But it has continued, despite the president's stated opposition.
Obama has done the spying in a far more aggressive way. Under Bush, they at least targeted people. Under Obama, they don't target anybody. Under Obama, it's all spying on everyone all the time. But an interesting thing about the NSA spying is the New York Times found out about it in early 2004 and sat on it until early 2005. Well, who should be upset about that? Certainly John Kerry, but in reality, every voter. Because every voter ought to have known what George Bush was doing to them behind their backs and illegally at the time he sought re-election. The Times, as a favorite of Bush, sat on it until after Election Day.
Wow. I want to move on to some contemporary stories. We're seeing marches. We're seeing people crowd Times Square here in Washington, D.C., standing on interstates and in some of the squares and circles here, in protest of this Garner case, where this man was apprehended by an officer in a chokehold. He died.
Right.
Your thoughts? The grand jury decided not to convict. They said there's not enough evidence.
Okay, I have a couple of thoughts on it. First of all, the physical act he was engaged in is not even a crime in New York.
The video looks awfully bad.
Selling cigarettes for $1 a pop. Cigarettes on which he paid taxes when he bought the cigarettes. He can't collect taxes. He's not authorized to collect taxes. So it was a subterfuge why he was stopped.
Right.
But to use deadly force, lethal force on a human being who's not using lethal force on you,
even though he's resisting arrest.
Even though he's resisting arrest, is a violation of federal and state law. But here's what the prosecutor did. Instead of using the grand jury as a charging instrument, is there enough evidence here to charge this person with this crime? That's all you have to ask the grand jury. He presented the whole case. He presented the cop's defense to the grand jury and let them decide whether or not the cop had been proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a perversion of the grand jury process. The prosecutor in Ferguson, Missouri did the same thing with respect to Officer Darren Wilson. These are two popularly elected prosecutors, not from my system in New Jersey and the federal system where you're appointed. These guys were more concerned with their reelection. They couldn't make a hard decision. They wanted the grand jurors to make the hard decision.
So is the Attorney General right, Eric Holder, to have federal oversight in both these cases?
Absolutely. Both of those cops will now be indicted by the feds. And let me tell you, it would have been easier for the justice system, for the victims, for the public, and for the cops themselves had they been tried in state court. When the feds try cops in federal court, the feds win.
Before I let you go, I was reading a great article you wrote in the Washington Post recently, and you talked about the erosion of the right to life and how neither party has any real awareness of this or any attempt to enshrine it and protect it.
When Ronald Reagan was president and had control, and the Republicans controlled the Congress, when George W. Bush was president, the Republicans controlled the Congress. A simple one-line statute would have undone abortion at its core. The fetus in the womb shall be considered for all legal purposes to be a person. Did we see such legislation signed? No. Did we see such legislation debated? No. Did we see such legislation offered?
No.
So how faithful are the Republicans to the pro-life cause, or is it just a mechanism to please some of their base?
Stellar book, amazing argument. Thank you for
Raymond.
being here.
You're very kind to give me this time.
Judge Napolitano, not at all.
All the best.
Suicide Pact, the radical expansion of presidential powers and the lethal threat to American liberty by Judge Andrew Napolitano is available at bookstores everywhere and online. It's a provocative and important read. And you can also keep up with the judge by visiting his website, judgenap.com.